Stacey Williams, and we are here with Trauma Responsive Practices, the project out of University of Chicago. So this is,
Hi, I'm Jessica Stephenson. I am also working with the TREP project at the University of Chicago. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, and then Stacey, do you maybe want to do the same? Okay, so I was a Chicago Public Schools teacher before I transitioned out of the classroom and started working in school improvement. So this is my second project that I've worked on in terms of school improvement initiatives.
And I'm Stacey Williams, and my background also is very varied in schools in several different states, working in intervention as a regular classroom teacher, administration, and some district coaching and things. And really the focus for me has been on working with those kids who are really challenging, really in need of our most intensive support. So when we're talking about schools that are trying to meet the needs of students that are really struggling, that has been my career, and that's what's brought me to Chicago. I've been here for about 6 years now in Chicago Public Schools, working on school improvement and working on supporting schools to do this work.
Okay, so we want to see a little bit about who is in the room. So if I name whatever your role is, just call out, yell out, whatever. I'm sure we're all a little sleepy after lunch, so it is okay. Be loud for a moment. I feel like as I was looking at name tags, I'm not going to get everybody on here, so that if I don't call out your role, then you can call it out afterwards, okay? So, school leaders, administrators, couple people. Teachers, all right. Counselors, other clinicians, like in the mental health field, maybe not in a school, working. Okay, awesome. Deans, awesome. Social workers in our other schools, great. Psychologists, I think you kind of already raised your hand. Clinician, student support staff, like other roles in schools. Okay, what did I miss? What? Partner organizations, community organizations. Okay, awesome.
Other departments within the district that support schools.
Okay. So other people from CPS departments, SEL. Okay. Cool. Thank you, guys. So just some norms to kind of consider as we are going into this session. First of all, give yourself the gift of presence. There's already been some talk about mindfulness and things like that today. And so when we think about mindfulness in the context of a learning environment, it really is giving yourself a gift of being there in the moment. So not thinking about some idea that you had in the morning session, not thinking about going to go pick up your kid after this, which is what I have to do, but really allowing yourself to be in that moment and experience whatever it is that the group has to offer you. The second, give each one another mutual respect, equity of voice, time. There are going to be times where you're doing like a turn and talk type thing throughout this. So just being mindful of that. And then give yourself the space and open time to grow. And I think that this, again, was said a lot in the morning sessions, that this is really, really hard work, that we all bring our own baggage into this work, and it's not going to be a fast process. And so giving yourself that space and that openness to grow through this process is going to be really important to allow you to continue to stick through it. Okay, so this is a lot. We're going to be giving you like an overview, a framework. There's going to be a lot of reiteration from what was said this morning, and I think that's a good thing because it's things that need to be said over and over again. We need to hear them a lot from a lot of different people in order to get them really cemented into our heads. So while this looks like a very ambitious list, I think we have some meaningful points of reflection for you and things like that. Well, that'll allow you to kind of take what we talked about in the morning and really dig into it deeper in a smaller context. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do, and we start a lot of our professional development with a mindfulness practice. We're actually going to do a short mindfulness practice in just a moment. So mindfulness, again, is really allowing yourself to be in the present moment. And the reason why part of that is so important is because when we live too much in the future and what we're worried about might happen, that causes a lot of anxiety. If we live too much in the past and things that we can't change, that causes a lot of anger and frustration. But most of the time, in the moment, we're okay. And we have to remind ourselves that in this moment, we're okay. So we might be worrying about, what am I gonna do with this student tomorrow? But right now, in this moment, that student isn't here. And so we can give ourselves the gift of presence to be able to think about what it is we need to think about, and that time will come that we need to address whatever it is that might be in the future. That's really kind of all mindfulness is. I feel like it's a big buzzword right now, but essentially that's really what it is. And when we do meditations, that's what we're trying to practice, is really understanding our thoughts and being more in touch with the present moment. So why do we do this in school? Why is this so important? So it changes our response to a situation. So as we become more aware and in tune with our bodies and what it's doing in the present moment, we can start to identify when we're starting to let ourselves get stressed out and change that much quicker. And it also helps facilitate things like active problem solving, things like positive and constructive responses to situations. These are all skills that we need if we're working with youth that are dealing with a lot of issues. These are all skills that we need when we're working in challenging school and community environments. And then it actually does things cognitively, physiologically, and emotionally in your body that produce like productive responses. So it's actually altering regions of the brain that are responsible for all of these different things. So we really are retraining our brains to respond to stress more productively. And then we can also change things like our respiratory rate, our blood pressure, our muscle tension. These are all things that tell our brain we're stressed. So if you like clench up your muscles, you're actually sending a signal to your brain, I'm stressed out right now, okay? And when we can relax our muscles, slow our blood pressure, slow our respiratory rate, then we're switching that reaction in our brain. So there's a lot of things that are going on physiologically when we do mindfulness. Right, ready, Sharon? Okay. So I've been to conferences before, and after lunch, this is usually how I feel. There's a lot of good ideas, there's a lot of information, but it is an overload. And so what we're going to do is practice a quick 3-minute mindfulness meditation. This one is from Headspace, and it's going to kind of help us erase some of those thoughts that we're having. So I invite you all to follow along with us. If this feels very new to you and maybe not comfortable to you, the most that I ask is that you just stay quiet. You can close your eyes if you want. You can get into it as deeply as you feel comfortable to make it cool.
So no matter what it is that's left you feeling overwhelmed right now, just take a moment for yourself to pause, undisturbed. Just begin by taking a big deep breath, breathing in through the nose, noticing how the body expands as it fills with air, and as you breathe out through the mouth, just gently closing the eyes, just allowing the breath to return to its own natural rhythm. And we're just going to imagine that all that thinking, all the sensation, emotion, physical tension in the body, it's just going to begin to melt away. I'd like you to imagine a steady stream of warm sunshine flowing down through the head into the body. It's as though as it travels into the body, it just dissolves any of that thinking, any of that feeling, just refreshing the body, leaving you feeling a little more relaxed and at ease. And that sunshine, we're just going to watch as it begins to fill the body from the toes, through the feet, into the lower half of the legs, again just melting away any discomfort. You begin to let go of those thoughts, moves into the upper half of the legs. Sunshine, bringing a sense of warmth, of ease, of space into the body. Continuing up through the stomach and the lower back. All the way up into the chest, the upper back and the shoulders. And just allow any thoughts to come and go. Just watching as that sunshine, that sunlight fills every part of the body as it travels down the arm, to the hands and the fingers. As it continues to flow down, now filling up through the neck and the throat, to the head and the face, every single last part of the body. Just feeling more spacious, more at ease, sense of warmth, of sunlight, just dissolving any feeling of discomfort or being overwhelmed. And just allowing that feeling to remain, bringing the attention back to the body, back to that being in contact and weight. Your awareness coming back to the space around you. And then when you're ready, just gently opening the eyes.
Thank you. So now that you're feeling clear and focused, we're gonna throw a whole bunch more information. So what I'm gonna talk about next is really kind of getting deeper into the why we're here, and really trying to frame it around potential. So whenever I go into a school, what I really look for is what are the opportunities here for growth. And so one of these potentials is really kind of following what you'll see that comes along with community art. And I'm going to contrast that with kind of typically how the school system is set up. So I really liked this morning how there was a lot of conversation on how this is situated, the school systems are situated within wider structures. So when I kind of talk through this bottom part, what I'm really talking about is the structures that are set up, the school system that has kind of been developed in the United States. So there are two different ways that we can view a challenge behavior that a student does. Kicks a chair and walks out of the room, writes, calls out, yells something at another student. And so what we can do is we can see that as internal dysregulation. And that's a lot of what we were talking about this morning in terms of a trauma-informed lens on child behavior. Or we could see it as willful defiance. And as adults growing up in America, we've been socialized to see it as willful defiance. Most school systems are set up to respond to challenging behavior as willful defiance, okay? So then we're gonna kind of see if an adult makes one decision or another, what does that lead to in terms of student outcomes? And so if we see this as internal dysregulation, then we're responding with proactive positive discipline. We're saying, you know what, that wasn't the right way to react, we're gonna practice doing this other way. And we are retraining their brain and we are giving them skills to better handle whatever emotion it was or whatever triggered that behavior. If we're seeing it as willful defiance, then we're punishing it, right? We're being reactive, we're being punitive, a lot of times very exclusionary. You're not going on a field trip, you're getting sent out of class, you're getting suspended from school. So then, if we're going from teaching, right, using positive discipline, those students are learning pro-social behaviors, okay? They might not come to us with them, but we are teaching them those pro-social behaviors the same way that we're teaching them math in the same way that we're teaching them reading. If, on the other hand, we have punitive discipline, that leads to decreased school belonging. So when we're saying you're not going on the field trip, you're getting sent out of class, you don't get all of these incentives, what we're saying to that student is, you don't belong here. When students are learning pro-social behaviors, that is increasing their time spent engaged in classroom instruction. And that's really what we want. We're trying to teach them the ways to be a student so that they can engage in instruction. When we are decreasing their school belonging, it can lead to an increased time spent in neighborhoods that we know are traumatizing for students. And then finally, what we see is the end goal, the really big end goal of trauma-informed or trauma-responsive schools is the maintenance of school engagement. It's students that no matter what experiences that they have outside of school, they come to school, they feel validated, they feel cared for, they feel supported, and they feel engaged in the whatever academic offerings that your school or organization has. Unfortunately, if they follow this arc, it a lot of times leads to juvenile justice contact. So when we start to talk about dismantling the school to prison pipeline and what trauma-informed schools, the role that they play in that is why. That as they get excluded from school, they're more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system. So you can kind of see the two different ways and how this initial adult decision on how to view student behavior can lead to two very different outcomes for kiddos. And so what we're really trying to do is move schools along this green arc. So there's a couple different ways to think about this. And so one is to think through what is a trauma responsive perspective? What is a trauma responsive view on education? And so one really important thing is that academic learning cannot be separated from students' emotional functioning or behavioral functioning. Okay, all learning is relational, all learning is emotional, and because of that, we can't do the academics if the emotional and behavioral supports aren't there. So the first thing is it's really important that everyone in your school building or everyone in your organization has a knowledge of physiological and behavioral dysregulation. Okay? It's very hard for someone to see behavior as dysregulation if they don't understand the science behind it. And then recognizing student-teacher trust as the foundation. So when we start to think about how do we create safe schools, how do we validate students, it really starts with that student-teacher relationship, and that needs to be a point of safety for students. And then get curious about students' life outside of school. So how do we form that relationship? Part of how we form this relationship is just our day-to-day interactions with students, right? So if a student does some type of behavior that's not being productive, I can either call that student out publicly or have a private conversation. That's going to be very different in terms of building that relationship. But it is also getting to know students outside of school, okay? And so a couple things to say about this. One, I was talking to one of the young people that had just been helping out with the conference, and I was like, okay, are we getting this right? Like, what else do we need to say? And a big thing was, she said, teachers make so many assumptions about us and why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And so that really comes to getting curious about students' life outside of school. I saw you sleeping in my class today, what was going on, right? I see that you're not doing work, what's going on? Instead of just making an assumption about why it was that they were doing that. I think the other reason it's really important to really get curious about the whole child is because we need to be strengths-based in our approach. We need to be able to see students outside of their trauma histories and be able to build on the strengths that they have. And sometimes it's very hard if a student is struggling in school to see a strength that they may have if you don't know them outside of the academic context. And what we can do is use those strengths that they may have outside of school to then pull them back into our classroom. We always want to continue to pull them back in, and that's really important. And then being able to depersonalize things that are said or done to us as adults by students, understanding that they are in a state of emotional or physiological or both of agitation, and that behavior is coming from a lack of ability to control that and not from any feelings that they may have towards us personally. And that's again where mindfulness comes in, because it's really hard as an adult to do that. And that's where the adult work comes in, because it's really hard to not take it personally. And then finally, prioritize the maintenance of student dignity. So this goes towards systems and structures in schools. This goes towards personal interactions. This goes towards curriculum design. Everything needs to consider student dignity. This is another way to look at, did everyone get pictures of that last one? Okay. No? Real quick. Okay. It's usually me like trying to take pictures, so I feel like guys. And I know I'm going through this fast. You are going to get points of processing, I promise.
Is there a place we can access this stuff?
This is the SAMHSA framework, so this is online somewhere. So it's just another way of looking, a different type of framework or a different way of approaching kind of the same thing that I just said. And so this is like, who is the trauma responsive educator? It's really understanding first about the brain science, about inequality and trauma. So really looking at that school to prison pipeline, looking at different intersectionalities of race and class and how all of that interacts with trauma in our schools. And then realizing our own assumptions and biases and how that is playing into the relationships that we have with students. So once that understanding is built, the trauma-informed teacher can recognize student dysregulation and they respond to it in a myriad of ways. And so this is really where the students are getting the support that they need through these different types of responses. And then finally, resisting re-traumatization. So another reality of our current school system is that schools themselves are often a place of trauma for students. So whether that's exclusionary discipline, whether that's, a teacher trying to put a student in their place because they are misbehaving, whether that's interactions, just student-to-student interactions, there's a lot of ways in which schools can be actually re-traumatizing. And so we want to be able to recognize that in our school systems and be able to resist that and build structures that are going to prevent these things. Yes.
Physical space, I was just looking in that.
Mhm.
What are examples? What is that?
Examples of physical space in terms of responding.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of different things. So like one thing is in being able to build self-regulation skills in students, which is one of the things you really want to do and infuse in your classroom. You might have like flex seating that might allow kids to wiggle a little bit because you know that you need that. It's being cognizant of just the layout, right? So like making sure that like students aren't so crammed together that they might feel physically unsafe. So there's a bunch of different ways, having a place where they can go and practice meditation or calming. There's a lot of different ways that you can do physical space. And at the very end, we have a slide on like a bunch of organizations that are doing this work. And so definitely take a picture of that one because you'll just Google and like go crazy. You can definitely go down the wormhole of that. So any other questions before I move on? Some of this will continue to like, it like moves a little bit, the presentation. So this is just the overview. So this is very similar to the end of that green arrow. Our aim is to increase teaching and learning and reduce time spent on discipline. But the way that we're doing that is through teaching those SEL skills, through teaching those social behaviors, so that the students can have the skills they need to access the instruction. Okay, so here is your first point of processing. So for the first 2 minutes, what I'm gonna ask you to do is reflect silently on your own. Just gather your thoughts, stay silent so that everyone else can gather their thoughts on the following questions. What is your school or organization currently doing to support students coping with trauma? What's going well? What are opportunities to strengthen your school's current practices? And then after 2 minutes, I'll give you a cue to share. That was 2 minutes. This is the first training I've ever done where everyone stayed quiet. So you guys are either very tired or just very quiet. So go ahead and share with someone near you, just kind of like where you're at, brief snapshot. Go.
I'm Ari. I'm not Alex.
What do you Oh my gosh. I'm a therapist. You know, something more than that all the time. But when family is like all these unmet needs, like the foundation of the society. If you're able to use this and create and policy and find other jobs saying that you want to Let's hear it in your eyes when you're ready to move on. All right, thank you so much.
So that was great, right?
So hold on to those thoughts. You will have a chance to continue to talk with your thought partners throughout. We're gonna move on to looking a little bit at the science of trauma. So when you think back to the framework that I just went over, a key piece of that, a foundational piece of it, is really understanding the science. I'm gonna go through this a little bit fast because it's really a review of what was talked about this morning. So I still want you to see it. I want you to hear it from a different person, from a different perspective. If I'm going way too fast, just like raise your hand and we'll explain that again, right? So when we look at what trauma really is, there's like a continuum that we're really talking about. And so there's a traumatic event, which is a singular event that happens, which causes the response of trauma. So when we're talking about trauma, that's the individual's response to this highly stressful event. A lot of times I like to think of it as like this feeling of like a loss of safety. A lot of times that loss of safety and stability is really what that traumatic event is causing. And then that can lead to traumatization. Not necessarily, but it can lead to traumatization. And so traumatization most likely occurs when someone doesn't have a support system around them. So this feeling of loss of safety that they have, that trauma that they have, just never gets resolved. And that is what's leading into traumatization. And then finally, it can lead, again, not always, not necessarily, but can lead to developmental trauma. And when we see developmental trauma, that's when traumatic events are happening over and over again, especially very, very young while that brain is still developing. And that's when we start to see changes in cognitive functioning, self-regulation, behavior, things like that. So students in our classrooms that we see that are very dysregulated, it is possible that they are suffering from developmental trauma, okay? But it doesn't, like this continuum doesn't always happen for everyone. It can the two siblings can experience the same event and not have the same response. The same person can experience the same event multiple times and not have the same response. So this isn't a one-for-one thing. It's very dependent on context. The other thing that I want to mention in this slide is when we think about schools and community organizations and therapists and things like that, our job is really to come in right here in between to prevent this traumatization. So when we start to think about what are the potentials for schools, what are the opportunities for schools and for teachers, it's really to be the support system, those strong relationships and that sense of safety that can prevent students from experiencing traumatization. And then polyvictimization is when students are experiencing trauma in multiple places. So maybe they have instability at home, then they're walking to school, they're experiencing community violence, and then they come to school and they have a teacher who is picking on them or a kid who is picking on them. And so that's when we start to see polyvictimization, where they have that feeling of loss of safety in many places. Okay. So this is a video from Jacob Ham, and he does a very good job of explaining this, so we're gonna watch it.
lessons, try not to do this study of addiction. In 50 locations across Chicago, Illinois, Wisconsin, Roosevelt is a national leader in addiction mental health treatment, serving more than 4,000 It's a residential setting.
Do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness. And it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony and look over the forest and figure out what's going on.
I'm gonna research.
On an emotional level, people in learning brain. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff. And what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness. And it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony and look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes. And they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn and stuff. And they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are.
Does that remind you of any kiddos that you know? That's why I like this video so much, because I feel like it really helps you visualize, in pretty clear terms, like what's really going on with those kiddos that we struggle with.
Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go to learning brain. And the way I think about it, it's kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down, and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and make putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock is, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby, protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain is kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants. We're going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments.
We use that video a lot. I call it the Mama Elephant video because I think that's such a powerful visual of really what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about trauma responsive schools. Is recognizing how important safety is I'm trying to get the person back. How important safety is, especially for students who've experienced trauma. Jacob Ham, just like the food, H-A-M. So yeah, it's a really great video. I think when you're thinking about like what are things you can do tomorrow, you can show someone this video because I think it's a really great foundational understanding, and I think it puts things in perspective. Somehow the screen got onto like mirroring instead of.
Keep on scrolling.
Keep on scrolling to the left. No, it's like not. It's really strange. It like got on mirroring instead of. I don't know what you did. I can get it back from here if it all. I just can't get it to, I can't get the person back on the computer. Okay. It's because it changed like the way that it's mirroring.
Try the window button and the letter P.
But if you'll let me do it, this isn't the way we had it, but I can do it this way. Sorry, guys. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So here's another visual that kind of is another way of looking at the brain development, again, that was talked about this morning, okay? So the speaker this morning was talking about that the brain develops from the brainstem up to the prefrontal cortex, and then what all of these different things are responsible for. So when we're thinking about thinking brain, that's your prefrontal cortex, that's up here, okay? The midbrain, that's like your emotional brain, responsible for emotions, those feelings of loving and belonging. And then the survival brain, that's the flight, fright, or freeze reaction, okay? And so this is, in a healthily developed brain, kind of the ratios of how like the power per se of the brain. Okay, so the brainstem is like a very short or very small part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is a much larger part of the brain. And that's why if we're normally healthily developed adult, we, like a quick response, so like we see a spider, right? We're like, ooh, right? But we're able to kind of calm that response right away, be like, okay, it's probably not one of the four ones. You know, we're able to have our thinking brain take over that really quick response, okay? So what we see in cases of neglect and trauma is that the brain actually develops differently, and that changes our ability to respond to stimuli in certain ways. So when we think of trauma, that means that the brainstem, that survival part of the brain, is actually being overdeveloped, okay? It's being stimulated all of the time because there are constant laws of safety, which means that it is physically overdeveloped in size, in the way that blood is being, like, directions to the brain, okay? Same with the midbrain, that feeling of am I loved, do I belong? That is being overdeveloped because it's always being questioned. Something else that can happen is with neglect, okay? So children who don't have strong connections with their caretakers when they're little, then the thinking part of the brain can actually become underdeveloped. Sometimes both happen, right? And so when we see that, what we see is that then it becomes even harder for that thinking brain to take over and being able to make critical thinking and analysis and things like that. So when you see students who are making behavioral choices that are like, what are you thinking, right? Why can't you figure this out? It is possible that it's really because their prefrontal cortex is struggling to take over that fight, flight, or freeze. Okay? And so that's why when we view behavior, we have to view it in this in need of support, in need of skills, in need of enriching situations that develop the prefrontal cortex, and not willful defiance. This kiddo's brain is not willfully defying behavioral expectations. They are struggling every single day to meet the behavioral expectations that you set. Yes.
I found that it really helps to talk to kids about this, especially kids who are having really dysregulated behaviors, and to give them that language. Even I work with young kids, and so we use the term like I flip my lid. So this is your emotion brain, and then your thinking brain is flipped, and you can't make a good decision because you're in this state of panic or worry. And that has made a huge difference in their ability to recognize it inside themselves and to ask for the help that they need.
This is another way to just visualize it is that their on switch, right, is constantly on, and that off is much harder to access. And we're starting to try to understand why students are making the behavioral choices that they are. So all of that to say, challenging behaviors that show up in your classroom that might be due to all of these developmental issues that we're talking about. So lack of impulse control. Hopefully now going through the brain science, you're understanding a little bit why these behaviors are associated with trauma. Aggression, trouble with friendships, either being super energetic or like just sleeping. Getting up and leaving the classroom, that's that flight response literally kicking in. So it's not like the student doesn't like math class, it's like this student sees something in my classroom that's threatening, so I'm leaving, right? Difficulty remembering or concentrating. Remember that prefrontal cortex is having a hard time activating. And so you can see all of these different things that students are experiencing are struggles because of that brain science that's going on from their experiences. Difficulty transitioning. Okay, I'm gonna hand it over to Stacy. I'm just gonna dig a little deeper into now Now that we know, what do we do about it in schools? Okay. Okay.
Hi. So as, we're kind of trying to juggle wanting to give you as much information that you can act upon and really kind of wanting to think about like, what can you do tomorrow? We're also pressed for time. So one of the things, that we have really found has been important is to keep coming back to the student perspective, to keep coming back to thinking about what is the experience that our students are experiencing all day long with us when they're coming to school. And so one of the things that we know about all of that brain science, that students with trauma histories, but also with lots of other things that are unstable living situations, chaotic home environments, like lots of things that are coming into play, make one thing in particular really, really difficult. And that is transitions. Transitions from place to place, transitions from person to person, transitions from one activity to another. Now sit with that and think about a school day. And what are we asking students to do all day long? 8 to 9 hours of the day. We are asking them to function at their weakest, least supported, less developed mode of operating. We have taken our most vulnerable students and then set them up to not have a fighting chance from the moment they walk into our buildings. So we have to rethink what is the experience of our students throughout the day. One of the biggest things when we're talking about positioning our schools to be trauma responsive is that we must help them know when they walk in the door they're safe. Oftentimes, they're coming from unsafe places, they're coming from instability, they're coming from chaos, they're coming from just a rough morning, which is going to flip that switch that we just talked about, right? This on-off switch. Remember, we're gonna have students walk in the door like this. And we have to have transitions that are supported so that they can get into learning rate. Because for students and staff, we cannot learn and take the kind of risks that we need to show up at school in the way that we need to if we don't feel safe. So now we're getting into kind of the cycles that happen, especially in our schools where we're trying to meet high levels of need of symptoms of trauma, because students are dysregulated, staff is dysregulated, staff is coming to school stressing about what if they're going to meet when they come in the door. And so then they are coming in anxious and students are anxious. And we have no opportunity to just and set all of our brains at ease. So one of the biggest things that we all can think about and take action on is like, what is the message from the very moment that you walk into a school? Well, many of the schools that I walk into, I have to walk to the metal detector. Is that gonna turn off this switch? Probably not. So what does that look like? How do we rethink that? If we want our students to be primed for learning, how do we get them to know you belong here, you're safe, we've got you, you can take a deep breath, you're good. Then we can learn that. But until we get to that place, that's really, where we're losing learning time, where we're losing instruction time, where nobody is regulated to be able to do this. So one of the practices that we are finding is when we start strategizing around opportunities to just calm down, when we start the day with mindfulness, that's one of those actions to be able to recognize the stress state and be able to send a cue that you can turn off that survival brain and you're okay for learning. So I wanted to plant that seed of thought as we're thinking about how do we create this different experience and how do we support all those transitions throughout the day to keep learning brain on and survival brain off. So I am going to kind of skip over a couple things in the interest of time to give you all some things, but this video that we were about to watch, as something that you could do tomorrow, is really powerful to take your staff through. It is called Giovanni Hernandez. You can find it on YouTube. It's Giovanni Hernandez Pain. And so it's actually a student telling their story in their words through the YMCA StoryCorps project. Yes. Giovanni Hernandez Pain, P-A-I-N is the title of it. So we were going to have you think through this because it's really impactful, and I'm sorry, but I want to give you kind of what you came for. So when we're talking about a trauma responsive school model, what we are talking about with TREP is that it doesn't provide a prescriptive model that works the same in every school environment. And that's really important that we hold on to that. We're not saying that it's the same everywhere. What we are saying is that it's asking all staff to subscribe to a common perspective that is attending to students and staff. This says teachers, but we're talking about everybody's emotional states. Everybody has the power to help turn off that survival brain and turn on learning brain. And we start planning around supporting those transitions by accessing all of the resources of all of the personnel in the building, so that whoever greets a child is aware that our goal is to help them feel safe. So we don't want to be using a sharp tone, or we don't want to have some of our corrections be yelling, or any of those things. We start thinking really strategically about our messaging through all of the adults in the building. And then we think about this prioritizing safety as physical safety, psychological safety, and emotional safety. So we're thinking of safety in very clear terms. I'm sorry, I just saw somebody trying to take a picture. Did you get it? So let me pause here for just a second. Physical safety is pretty straightforward, but we want to make sure that people know that they're going to be safe from fights breaking out or from teachers feeling like their physical safety is threatened. So we really want to make sure that everyone in the building feels safe. When we're talking about psychological safety, we're talking about students being able to know that they can fail safely, that they can take risks with their learning and they're going to be okay, that they're not going to be ashamed or shamed or humiliated or embarrassed, and that we're talking about those psychological impacts. Again, going back to what Jessica said earlier, we want students to know they belong at school, you belong here, this is your place. And so these safety messages are really part of that. And then emotional safety is where we want them to be able to know that they have people that are supporting them, that they can socialize with their friends and feel safe, and all of those things about care and attachment. We work within an MTSS tiered system. And really, we're talking about at tier 3, that's the individualized intervention, right? We're talking about students who have individual, very real needs. Tier 2, we're talking about students who can benefit from some small group work. But what we recognize with TREP is that tier 3 and tier 2 students still spend the majority of their time in tier 1 spaces. They're getting treatment at tier 3 or tier 2, but they are going to be with their regular classroom teacher 90% of the time, or 4 days out of the week. And so what we want to think about is, how do we support tier 1? The other thing that makes what we're talking about very flexible and adaptable to any school environment is that we really are not asking you to do something new. We're asking you to do things that we know are best practices and good for all students, and that we have found to be especially beneficial for students with trauma histories. So an example of that is like the supports that we put in for English language learners. Those can be really helpful for that trauma brain that's having a hard time focusing. To have multi-sensory instruction going on is going to land with the student with trauma history just as powerfully as the student who's struggling to learn English. So we're talking about best practices across the board that are good for all, and that we found are especially helpful to support transitions. So those are things like pre-planning, letting students know when a transition is happening. That is actually a practice that is often done for students who may be on the spectrum because they need routine, but so do students with trauma histories. Are you seeing where we're going with this? So you want to think about the universal social and emotional supports and practices that you can find to be beneficial for all, and then those can become these supportive, safe, consistent environments that support our students with trauma histories. I'm seeing a lot of head nods. You with me so far?
Yeah.
So for us, our particular intervention operates through these domains. So I wanted to give you a brief overview. So really, it's under this wrapping our arms around the prevention and management of secondary traumatic stress. That's really where we are, is that we're looking at how do we support adults who are trying to support these students. How do we create our schools to be climates that are supported for adults to feel safe, for adult SEL to be met, for adult needs to be met? And all of these factors support adults as much as they do for students. So an example of that, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but I want to point out mindfulness for all. When a teacher opens the class with mindfulness at the start, it is a transitional cue to support that transition into learning for students, but it also supports the teacher's regulation so that the teacher can center and the teacher can center and the teacher can focus on teaching, which is what we're trying to get to, as the students are getting that supported transition into learning. So when we're looking at these intervention domains, really talking about, as I said before, the adult well-being in the building, and thinking about that even before we're moving into the classroom interventions. How healthy is our staff? How are we doing on thinking about burnout? How are we supporting one another? What does that look like? And then when we're thinking about mindfulness, really, this is a resilience building. So I have become much more practiced in this through this work, because on any given day, you may be in your one school and it's intense, but I might go to 4 schools like that. So I will pause and take the long way through the trees, breathe in the flowers, pause, just for 60 seconds before I go into a meeting. And then I can find that my brain can show up in the ways that I want to show up. So we're talking about resilience building, we're talking about buffering for stress, we're talking about really being able to be healthy and resistant, knowing that we're showing up in hard spaces. We're preparing for what's ahead. And then multi-level safety, I mentioned before, so that's our physical, psychological, and emotional safety, and that we think through all of our academic tasks through that lens, right? We think through how do we set up this learning environment that accounts for each of those. And then strong relationships for all. Learning is a social activity. It is in socializing, it is in relationships. Children do not learn from people that don't like them or they think don't like them. So we want to be able to center relationships as that is what increases learning. That's what increases motivation. That's what gets kids to show up against all of these obstacles, even to just get to school. It's the relationships. And those relationships are the amazing lever that we have as educators and in our schools to help that brain heal. This is where it all lives. It's in relationships. So when we think back to that brain and the brain science, and we think back to that developing brain that has a really strong brain stem and emotional response, the parts that need to develop are parts that get developed through social interaction. So all of those ranges of being able to reason and think, that comes from the social interaction. That's why neglect makes that part of the brain smaller. So that's our opportunity for us to literally be brain surgeons as educators, to optimize the neuroplasticity of that young brain to change. And we can do that. What we also look at are foundational SEL practices, so that when we are structuring our days, remember those supported transitions, we're also thinking about intentionally creating space for direct instruction on how to regulate emotions, how to socialize properly, how to talk to one another, how to engage. We need to do this as direct instruction, just like we're doing math, science, reading, social studies. It has to be taught. And so you want to think about that in the day. Where is that being taught? And then embedded SEL practices are where we're thinking about how we're delivering subject matter with SEL in mind. What does that look like? This is really your lever for bringing in that psychological, emotional, safety aspect into instruction. It's embedding your SEL into your math lesson, into thinking about reading.
What would be a good example of where you do that now?
In math. So you might think about how you're setting up your cooperative groups so that a student who may not be, so one very practical thing, are you familiar with Kagan? So Kagan cooperative structures, I'm a huge fan. One of my regular classroom teaching assignments, I had 42 fourth graders with inclusion. I had 5 different home languages. I spanned levels 1 to 3 in language abilities. And I had a gifted and talented cluster of little brainiac fourth graders who were ready for algebra, all in one room. And we were packed in a room where we literally could not all stand up at the same time. So half the room stood up and went out the back door, the other half stood up and went out the front door. And I looked at them and I thought, it's just me, we're gonna have to do something. And Kagan saved me. So just real quickly, what Kagan offered was a way to structure your cooperative groups in a way that looked at their ability levels in the subject that you were teaching. So they were flexible, but you organize them in such a way so that they're buddy partners were kind of near pairs. So you had students that were at a low level with a mid-low and a high with the advanced, and then they were their talking partners and support partners and peer in that way. And so it really was the way that we were able to still move the needle and make progress in things, because students who needed more support were able to get it from peers who were able to do that supportive social connection. So that's one example. So when we're thinking about the intervention actions, I want to check on time. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So when we are working with schools, so we do some initial work with administrators to think about what are the strengths that are already happening, because we've all been trying to address this for a while now, and there's a lot of good things that are happening. So we kind of do this assessment to see what are the things that are already happening, and then we work out with your team a TREP professional learning community. And so these are where we identify a team of folks who are going to kind of lead the work. And we ask for this to be staff across the building represented. And then we work on all staff capacity building. So that's where we really want to make sure that we have a basic level of what we're talking about and the knowledge of trauma, the effects in learning, what is going on with students. And then we work on school-wide shifts among adults. So in the trauma responsive educational practices, there's a lot of mind shift work, right? A lot of mindsets that need to change, a lot of ways that we're socialized that needs to change. And so that's really the deep work that we're doing with adults. And then all of this work is with adults in order to get to the improved behavioral and academic outcomes. But it's really about getting adults to really plan strategically around supporting that. So I'll give you all a minute, so seeing cameras go up. Ready? Okay, so really these are the outcomes that we are going for. So it starts at the bottom. We want to deepen educators' knowledge of trauma responsive educational practices. What are the opportunities in our educational practices to really take this knowledge into a meaningful way? And then reducing educator and student emotional reactivity and behavioral dysregulation. This is that stress piece. This is that reactivity. This is where I was talking about before, teachers coming in, anticipating how stressful it's going to be, students coming in, all stressed out, and then we have this cycle happening. We really work to calm this down, really get this to calm down. So we're talking about reactivity to one another. And then strengthening the trauma responsive pedagogical skills. So being able to respond in meaningful ways. And these two in the middle really work together, because when we can calm ourselves, when we get our own stress responses under control, then we can step back and have more creativity to respond and not get whipped into the reaction. It's the whipping into reaction that brings out the stuff that is not helpful for the students. But it's the, okay, that just happened, it's not about me, I need to take a minute. What are my resources to take a minute that the school has provided me? How do I do that? Okay, here's a meaningful way that I can respond. And so that's really like about time and space and being able to find ways to give that to ourselves, to just respond and not be controlled by the reactivity. And then we're looking at all of those safety measures. So these three things, people need to understand what's happening with trauma and that there's a real effect. And then they need to be able to get regulated. And then they need to be able to have some tools in their toolbox to know how to respond. And then we can start talking about increasing that safety. So there's a lot of work before we even can start getting to the things that show up in the classroom. And then we're building strong student-teacher relationships. Really, that's happening all the time, but that really becomes a strong focus for us. And we have some very specific tools and some ways to do that, and some things to think about that really intentionally. One of the things that we have seen in the research is that belonging and student connectedness are two of the most powerful levers for student achievement. Even greater than their prior school experience, greater than their academic capabilities or their preparation, it is, do I belong here and do I feel connected? And so we really want to strengthen that and optimize that, because that's what changes the trajectory for students who are at risk for failure. Did I see your hand?
Can you just repeat, belonging and student connectedness are?
Two levers that are really powerful when we're talking about achievement. And then that developing of student self-regulation. We want to give the students the skills. And I loved the example that I heard about teaching students about the brain. I have seen that be so empowering for students. When they recognize, I can do something about this, I don't have to feel out of control, there's really powerful shifts that can happen. We've seen students ask for mindfulness before throwing a punch. When the year before, they had fights every day. Students want to feel good. They want to be regulated. And once they start feeling that, at first, sometimes they get a little squirmy. This is weird. This is kind of, I haven't felt this before. Calm doesn't feel good until you learn to realize that it can feel good. And so as they're starting to do that, we're seeing more and more that students, we've seen one of our schools now has a problem. Before they had a problem with attendance, where it was all they could do to get kids to show up, doing mindfulness in the morning, they have kids showing up earlier than teachers, and their problem is having enough staff there for all the students who are coming who want to do mindfulness before the day starts. Because they just want to get back to someplace safe, that feels good, and to feel regulated. So all of that you can see then works at that motivation and engagement. That's where we're headed, is keeping kids in school, increasing learning time, increasing teaching time, being able to really move the needle on this is where you belong. So I think at this point, I'll turn it back to Jessica.
Okay.
She'll go over kind of our practices a little bit more in depth.
Cool.
And then I think we might have some time for questions.
Okay, before I go into this, just want to give you guys a little bit of a conversation point, because I'm feeling just information saturation. And I know for myself, like, I'm a verbal processor. So for those of you who are feeling that way, what I would like you to do is just quickly turn and talk and share with someone sitting next to you one thing. It doesn't have to be from this session, one thing you really want to start doing in your own professional practice. That's one takeaway from today. Okay? Ready, go.
Oh, yes. Administration You like clean. I'm not in school for you. Absolutely. Yeah. So I can be.
Right, we're gonna connect you in 3, 2, and 1. Alright, I have this right in front of me, I got your eyes, thank you. Feel like by the windows is good. This side of the room, we're almost there, thank you. Okay. So we're gonna dig a little bit into like some of the key fundamental practices that we work on with teachers in schools. And there are more turning points during this session, okay? So, what is a trauma responsive practice? It's just that evidence-based teaching practice, right? These aren't new practices. We just know that they work for students with trauma histories. One of the things we're gonna talk about in this section of the workshop is looking at what an instructional approach to behavior is. You're about to dig into what that is. Recognizing that a trauma responsive school becoming trauma responsive is complex. There isn't one answer. It's going to take time. Any type of change in schools usually takes about 3 to 5 years. So just recognize it's gonna take time. And I think that it takes time on every level. It takes time for administration to change, for teachers to change, for kiddos to change. Self-care and collective care are really, really critical in being able to provide students with the support that they need. So Stacey already talked somewhat about that. I want to reiterate it here because it's that important. We've had professional developments where we've had one thing planned, and we walk in and we can just sense the stress level in the room, and we've changed it and just done like, we're gonna do some mindfulness. We're gonna talk to each other. We're gonna have a snack. Like, those are all things. So, I'm hearing some giggles. So my teaching coach like changed my life because he's like, you know, if you're really, really hungry, you're having a hard time eating while you're focusing while you're teaching, like, you can eat something. And I'm like, what? Changed my life. So yes, taking care of yourself. So here's what we mean by instructional approach to behavior. When a student makes an academic error, we teach them how to do it differently. When a student makes a behavioral error, typically schools punish them, right? That's essentially what we're saying. What we want to do instead is when students make a behavioral error, we teach them the behavior that we want them to do instead, just like we do with academics. That's really all that we're talking about. And so the next slide tells you a little bit more. We're gonna walk through this activity. Oh, sorry. Okay. So we're gonna apply this. So in your own heads, imagine you have a student who's having a hard time learning how to divide whole numbers. Think for a moment, what steps would you take to support that student? Go ahead and share with the partner. We're gonna back together, 3,
That works for me.
2, and 1. So now think you have a student who's having a hard time putting away their materials at the end of a work session. How can you apply instructional practices, so whatever you said here, helping that student reach behavioral expectations? So you're thinking about, do I need to do modeling? Do I need to provide visual supports? Do I need to reteach it? Do I need to allow them additional time to practice it? Do I need to explain it in a different way? Do they need a buddy? Those are all instructional practices that as teachers, we're trained to do for academics. But we're not necessarily trained to think about behavior in the same way. And that's one of those cultural shifts that we're talking about when we're talking about trauma responsive behavior. Okay. So in order to be able to do instructional approach to discipline well, we need to reframe the behavior, right? I'm gonna put some words up here for those of you taking pictures, so you can see the whole thing. Okay, and so this is kind of another way of visualizing that slide that I had with the 2 paths, with the green arrow and the red arrow, pretty much the same, but it's just a different way of looking at it. So again, it's that important that I want you to see it in a different way. This is really applying the growth mindset to behavior. So seeing it instead of won't as can't yet. And when we see behavior as can't yet, we're curious about why. We ask students why. We don't make assumptions. We try to figure out what is going on as to why that student can't reach behavioral expectations. And then what we see our role as adults is, do I need to take things away that are getting in their way? Do I need to add additional supports to help them reach that behavioral expectation? And then that greatly changes the child experience, because they went from feeling frustrated, guilty, ashamed that they couldn't reach behavioral expectations to feeling supported, strengthened, that they belong. And we know that they have to feel supported, strengthened, that they belong to access academic content. A child who's feeling shamed can't learn that. So that's really what we're going with all of this. Oh, I made one more point about this, I'm sorry. They're still being asked to reach that behavioral expectation. I just sometimes when we talk to people, they're like, oh, so you're just gonna want to get away with their behaviors because they're having a hard time. No. But what we see our adults, what we see our role as adults is that we have to teach them how to do it. Just like they don't come to us knowing multiplication, they might not come to us knowing how to self-regulate. And so it's not that they can continue to get away with being dysregulated, but we have to teach them how to do it. Okay, so here's a couple examples of what might happen in your classroom and how that can be reframed. So student conflict escalates in a manner that is unsafe and uncharacteristic of your classroom. If you're looking at behavior as communication, what you're gonna think about in your head is, okay, students need additional skills on cooperative work and conflict resolution. Maybe I'm gonna teach that in advisory. Maybe I'm gonna work that into my math lesson. We're gonna talk about cooperative work real quick before we get into our groups. Maybe children are using materials in unsafe ways, right? If we're seeing behavior as communication, then what that's telling us is, I need to remind students how to use these crayons before I pass them out. I can't assume because on the first day of school I told them, and now it's October, that they remember that this is what we do with crayons. Especially students with trauma histories have a hard time holding all of that information in their heads. So what we do is something called pre-corrections. We remind students right before they have to do something what that behavioral expectation is. children are working together when the expectation is they should be working individually. This even happens with adults, right? We're like, here, work quietly on this, and all of a sudden there's a group of adults talking about something. What's that telling me? They might need more support around asking or accessing additional resources to complete the work. So if your expectation is that they're working silently and they don't know a word, they go to a dictionary, but instead they're asking a friend, well, maybe I need to reteach that expectation. So again, it's really looking at what are we doing as adults to support student behavior? And it's flipping that responsibility onto the adults to say, okay, what do I need to do differently so that students can meet these expectations? So here's a couple questions. This is truly a self-assessment. I'm just gonna give you about a minute to read and to think about them. A lot of times our approach to behavior is very personal because it's rooted a lot in just the way that we were brought up and our own beliefs. So this is just a quiet, about a minute to just kind of reflect on where we're at and maybe where we need to go. To Stacy. She takes a drink. You gotta take care of yourself. Yeah, so it's a way to model taking care of yourself.
Okay,
That's
good.
what that was.
Okay, we can think about it. So I want to move us into thinking a little bit about what we have learned from the research about implementation. And as you were thinking about that question before, I think one of the things that we all need to just hold, kind of hold up in this work is that it is not the way that we were trained. When we think of like education in general and training, how much time do we spend on things like classroom management or being able to do some of these behavioral, social, emotional? I'm seeing in more teacher preparation programs, it's happening a little bit more in the last 5 years, but most of us in this room have probably been doing this a little bit longer than that. And so we really need to give ourselves, just cut ourselves some slack, give ourselves some room. One, to recognize that this is new, and two, that we're learning as we go. So that's also something that is really important to recognize. Just understanding trauma and the effects, the long-lasting effects on learning is really relatively new. We're talking about new science and new research. So when we're bringing this into the forefront of thinking about trauma-responsive schools, it's not, we're all kind of carving the road as we go. So one of the key things to know is that it takes time. Research shows it takes about 3 to 5 years for a school system to realize a transformation change. And when you think about the deep types of change that we're talking about with all that we presented, we're talking about even sometimes 5 to 7 years. So that's important to just kind of, okay, it's gonna take a minute. We work with schools to lay the foundation and the path for change and develop those systems and build the structures and to really strengthen the capacity of the change agents. And I kind of paused here intentionally in this slide to say for the long haul. Because again, if we're talking about 5 years, one, we need to make sure that our change agents have the resilience and the strength and the stamina to hang in there that long, right? So that we don't lose our institutional learning every year because of turnover. So that we don't lose momentum because of new initiatives. So we want to really think intentionally about the long haul. And then think about it as a marathon. It's not a sprint. So we want to be able to do this well and to be able to think about it in a way that is lasting and sustainable. So one of those things that is important and really actionable and helpful is to think about the types of change. So with this, there's two types of change when we're talking about changing a system that can be really helpful to recognize and identify in your planning. So one is technical change. Technical change is typically easy to identify. It's usually just one or two places that need to change, and the solutions are often really quick, and they're pretty simple to implement, usually through an edict of somebody with authority. So you could come back to your school tomorrow if you're in a position of authority and say, we're gonna start the day with mindfulness. And that could be at a technical level, something that could be started immediately. And in that type of technical change, it isn't dependent on a mindset shift to realize a level of benefit. So in that example, what I was talking about with mindfulness, there's a school that is playing it over the intercom. And so it isn't dependent on a teacher being bought into doing it. It's happening, and because of just the pause, the act of pausing in the day, everybody's calming down. Then we talk about adaptive change. Adaptive change is much more complex. It's often difficult to detect or identify because it's coming from lots of different places. It's often hard to figure out what the root is of the problem. And the change really depends on beliefs and values and roles and relationships and shifts that are really complex. And then solutions, really, they come about through experimentation. And then you kind of stumble on the solution. And they're really slow to be realized. So taking that mindfulness example, mindfulness also has an adaptive change component. And so in the adaptive change, while it could be implemented through a simple, we're going to do this practice now, it's going to happen through the intercom, and this is how it's going to go at the start of our day from 8:50 to 9 every morning. And there is a benefit. The teacher who does mindfulness for themselves and comes in regulated has that much greater benefit and greater resilience and greater health benefits. And then the teacher who does it for themselves and starts the morning and recognizes that this is a regulation skill that my students can develop so that they implement it after lunch or when something disruptive in the environment happens. Maybe there's a lockdown drill. So we do mindfulness before we jump back into learning. When they start using it in that strategic skill development way, they've accelerated because the adaptive change was able to be realized. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a benefit at the technical change. It just means when it's at the adaptive change, it's even deeper and longer sustained. So identifying the level of change of the goals when you're planning is really helpful so that you can plan strategically. This year, we're just going to look at the technical change of the way that we do mindfulness. We're just going to implement it in the morning. Next year, we're going to go for a level of adaptive shift. And over the course of this year, we're going to bring it into our PDs. We're going to do it as a practice, as adult SEL. We're going to bring it into other places. We're going to do some training. We're going to chip away at that adaptive stuff while we're still benefiting everybody on the technical level. Is that landing? So I wanted to give you an example from the field. So one of the things that we talk about with the TREC project is this, and this is one of your takeaways to start thinking about. anything predictable can be preventable. Anything predictable can be preventable. So what that means is when you start anticipating that something is going to happen because it happens all the time, that's a pattern. So you start looking for patterns that might be back to that unsafe feelings or patterns of chaos or patterns of disorganization or patterns where transitions are really difficult. And then you can start planning how to do some prevention. One of the strategies that we promote, we call planned responses. And it's tied to this: anything predictable can be preventable through a planned response. Again, remember, we're lowering reactivity and we're wanting to respond proactively and preventatively. So we think through challenging situations, times in the day, behaviors for students, and then we think about the pattern that emerges. Every time that class comes back from music, they are dysregulated, chaotic, and I can't get through my math lesson. Soon as I can say every time they come back from such and such, I have a pattern. I'm predicting it. I can plan for it. So therefore, every time my students come back, I'm going to teach them that we're going to start with mindfulness. That's an example of one of the schools we're working in, so that the teacher would prep the room for mindfulness. And now at this point in the year, for fourth grade students know that mindfulness is coming after music. So if music starts going long, they'll be like, we have to get back for mindfulness. We need to stop this. We need to get back for mindfulness. And they'll come in and the students will set it all up, and I was observing it was all going almost completely independent of the teacher. They got in position, they were calm, they were ready. And that transition into math, we were able to get back 25 more minutes of math instruction that we had been losing from a chaotic transition. So in this example that I have up here, the technical change was that they wanted to implement a planned response as a tier 1 strategy. And they started to see there were some predictable patterns that emerged. And it was pretty clear that it was in 1 or 2 places. Everybody across the building was having a hard time returning to class after lunch. Pretty straightforward. The solution was to have teachers plan a response for that time of day. And we did that in a grade level team meeting. So at grade bands, they were able to co-plan together what would be this planned response. How are we going to respond? We're seeing that it happens all the time. You can plan a response. And then explain what the new routine was, and then practiced that new routine. And that's getting back to that instructional approach to these behaviors. We teach them, we practice them, we reteach them. And that's what we're talking about. And so sometimes that means that you come up with something and then it's kind of gets skewed or off track or something, and then you recognize, oh, we need to go back, we need to reteach it, just like we need to reteach anything academically. So oftentimes, back to that predictable patterns, right? When you think larger, you can predict when students come back after a long break, they often come back dysregulated. We can predict it. So we can plan when students come back after winter break, we are going to practice our routines. Instead of spending the week disciplining everybody back into shape, we're just going to devote Monday and Tuesday to practicing routines. That's what we do when we come back from break. Now we have a planned response that everybody in the building knows, like, oh yeah, this is our routine, this is how it's going to go. And that creates safety. When we can plan responses, we get predictability and consistency, which creates safety for all. So, I want to,
We've got 8 minutes.
okay, we did it.
Yay.
We were trying to figure out how to condense this quickly. So I wanted to give you this slide. This is the one to take a picture of. And to say this very clearly, don't do the work alone. One of the biggest changes in our mindsets is to get out of the isolation that happens in education. We get siloed into our classrooms. We get siloed into our different departments. We get siloed as the school psychologist who doesn't get to be in the same collaborative grade level teaming. We get siloed in all of these different ways, and then our schools get siloed. And our schools are in trauma. I was with a school when a horrific, tragic event happened at a neighboring school, and we shared the students in the community. We were separated by an alley, and we had to fight for the resources of the trauma staff because we were isolated. We've got to figure out how to do this work together. So if there's a school that's also doing this work or serving a similar population or is right across the way, figure out how do we do this together? How do we share? How do we collaborate? All of these resources are just some of the few that we draw on and work with. Is TREP Educators
.org.
So trepeducator.org, if you don't have that.
It's on the
Printed?
handout. I think
Oh,
it's
okay,
on the
great.
bottom of the handout.
Okay. So yeah, trepeducator.org is also where we have a lot more of our research briefs that have very clear practices. Jessica and I, as classroom teachers, bring a lens of like, okay, how can a teacher pick this up and do it tomorrow? So that's our research briefs, and you can dig into that for more practices, and there's lots of information always going up on there. And then all of these different resources are for you to be able to access. And also in this room, like we're all here trying to address the same thing. So don't leave today without figuring out how do you do this work for someone else.
So can I talk really quickly
Yes,
just about a couple
please.
of the resources?
Yep.
So Edutopia, if you haven't checked out this website, it's great for a ton of different teaching practices. They have really short videos. They have easy to digest articles that I use in professional development a lot. So when you're asking about like actual classroom practices, that's a great resource. For those of you who have long commutes like me, Mindshift is a podcast, also really, really great, talks about different things in school, including trauma responsiveness. They also have like some written articles that you can use. Calm and Headspace are both mindfulness apps that you can have on your phone, your computer. Calm.com/schools, you can get it for free if you're an educator. So that's awesome. Those are the ones that I wanted, that I felt like are like super easy to access, that I'm always going to when I'm looking for new information. And then a ton of just great organizations in the Chicago area.
So we wanted to at least give you a little bit of time to ask each other questions or ask us any questions before we break.
I think we're ending at 3:10, so.
Okay.
I have one more app to add to your, it's called Insight Timer, because I know like those kinds of things, kids are very resistant sometimes, like, oh, I don't like to do that. Insight Timer, I feel like appeals to kids.
Right.
To kind of like hit, like, oh, I'll do a bicycle one. Or like bike riding, do that kind of thing.
Yeah, Insight Timer. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the things you do to help change the minds, or mind shift, the whole staff?
I think that there's this constant tension between like, does information change mindset, or like does doing things change mindset? And so I think we try to do a little bit of both. So some of it is presenting like the brain science, presenting statistics on the school to prison pipeline, like all these different things, looking at individual school data, right? Like going in and doing a classroom observation and saying like, no, you really did correct Jacob's behavior 17 times in 30 minutes. Like I did a tally, right? So there's like presenting the information, But then sometimes if you just try it and you do it, that will change mindset. So, and that's kind of where like the technical change comes in of just saying, you know what? You're gonna greet all your students at the door with a smile. I don't care if you believe in it or not. I'm the principal, that's what I'm gonna do. And then teachers are like, oh, when I smile at my kids, like they're more regulated. Imagine that. And so I think that it really is striking a balance between those two different things.
The other thing that I would say to that too, all of that, and you find those folks among you who are doing this. So our hope, right, who want to, but also our hope from this time was that you kind of leave with a trained eye on like, oh yeah, I noticed that so-and-so has really great classroom management. What are they doing relationally, right? What are they doing to set the space? What are they doing that's calming? How are they supporting transition? So you can start to connect the dots between what's really working. And then those are folks that you also can help, because we actually have seen that change happens much faster when it's peer-to-peer. And so that's also been really an activator in the mindset shift.
And so one of the things that I've started doing because of that in PDs is I'll ask like, who's already doing this practice? And it's one to acknowledge those people, but it's also because then the teachers around the room are like, oh, some of my coworkers are actually already doing this. And so it's kind of that positive peer pressure. Yeah.
But as a first learning teacher, I've been working with some of the teachers, and I've been particularly when I started driving this teacher nuts, blah, blah, blah. That's the little squares with that. So they're great. So there were some things where you could sit down and you talk to the class, notice what is looking at what you want to work on. You want to is it not a contract? It's just kind of creating making out of that. I think 4, 5, 6 years. She could little things from those. And now all of a sudden every day, oh, Miss D, look at it. So and so, he's doing so much better. He's had 9 stars today. And or he's had a little bit tough of the day, but it's getting better. So draw on, so what you said, draw on yeah, and then it's like one minute. So you don't have to little boy, and trying to get him right. So I had right sentence. And he got mad. Because I had to try and write sentences in the paragraph. An hour and 45 minutes meltdown. Because I was so then we finally got it done in 5 minutes. Oh gosh. It only took me 5 minutes, and I could do that, and I'm like, yeah. And this is a secondary. So next time he comes in, something happens, starts to have his button meltdown, lasts for 10 minutes, and remembers the last time, I'm like, oh, if I get this done, then I can go, or I can have my treatment. Right. So sometimes it's just stuff in the bag, and I know again, teachers can't. I'm also check. So again, sometimes you can have the hour to get it. Sometimes you just reactive, not fighting.
So I want to emphasize something that you said about like drawing on your diverse learner team. Diverse learner teams, also pre-K, K1, teachers are needing to do SEL all day long. So you have some resident experts with some of these practices, and that's part of what I'm talking about is getting out of the isolation and to think about everybody in the building is an asset. Everybody in the building can add to a positive culture, can build collaborative relationships, can be a positive relationship, a reparative relationship for a student. Some of your most powerful relationship builders are your custodial staff, and we don't realize that. Like, you want to think about the experience of the student throughout the day and how many points of connection, positive relationship, and supported transition that they can have throughout the day. And then you can start thinking about all of the assets in your building to be able to create that support environment. So, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.